Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing Spellbinders April 2026 clubs. First, we have the Market Weave embossing folder of the month. And then we have the 3D embossing folder of the month called Market Crates. So this has a bunch of crates all stacked up. Then we have the stamp and coordinating die of the month, Fresh Packed. Perfect with lots of different sentiments as well as some images to stamp. This here is the large die of the month called Market Tote. So you have the border for the tote as well as the handle and all the different things that you can put in it. This here is the stitching die of the month called Rooting for You, and you could easily combine this with the tote as well if you wanted a few different vegetables. This is the press and foil of the month. It is called Seed Company Border, and for this month there is black foil that goes along with it. This is the die of the month called Pansy Seeds, some pretty pansies with a pot for them to go in. This also coordinates with that better press and foil of the month. The stencil of the month is called Market Berries, perfect for backgrounds. And this stamp set is the All Clubs Crate bonus item of the month. It's called Market Trio. And then we also have the All Clubs Crate exclusive item called Market Jar Trio, and they coordinate well together. I'm actually going to be creating a few cards with that because I just love the combination of the two of them together. I'm going to start off by hot foiling the press and foil of the month. I'm going to foil this background twice for different things as well as solid hot foil it, and then I'm also going to use it in the better press system because I wanted to do one that was embossed. I'm using the foil that comes with the club this month. So I have my hot glimmer system. I put that plate down with the pattern side up, the foil with the pretty side down, and I'm using some hammer mill cardstock here. Put the plates on top, press that timer button, and once that's done, I run it through my die cutting machine. So you need the heat as well as the pressure to do hot foiling. Once that's finished, I can peel that foil off, and I'm going to save the negative foil to do my solid hot foiling. For my second foiling of this background, I'm taking one of the sentiments that come with it, adding it to that background. So we have one background with the sentiment and one without. Then I'm putting that foil pretty side down, hammer mill cardstock on top of there, plates on top, and then pressing that timer button. Once that goes off and stops blinking, I put it through my die cutting machine. Now I'm using it for this video with the black foil that comes with the press and foil of the month. Obviously it works well with any of the different colored foil. So if you wanted to add a metallic touch or a color, it would work with that. This press and foil of the month has a bunch of different sentiments to it, as well as dies that coordinate with those sentiments. So I'm also going to foil them as well as solid hot foil them. I always love to do my foiling all at once so that I have things ready to go when I'm doing my card making, especially the sentiments. It's always nice to have a ton of sentiments sitting there ready to go, easy to grab and easy to look through to see exactly which sentiment I think would work best. Once I have all of my foiling done, I can put my solid hot foil plate on there, wait a few minutes for that to heat up. It does heat up fairly quickly, but you do want to give it just a bit of extra time. Then the stacking is exactly the same with the foil pretty side down, and this time I'm using the negative foil from the other foiling. And then hammer mill cardstock on top, plates on top, press that timer button, and once that stops blinking, I run it through my die cutting machine. So here we have now black sentiment or black outline with white sentiments on top of it. So some pieces that I'm creating are going to be more suited for that negative foiled sentiment than it is for the foiled sentiment. So any of those sentiments that I have left over, I'll just store them with the press plate or stamp set that they're created with. That way next time I'm using either that press plate or stamp set, if I want to, or I might already have a sentiment ready to go that I've created before that's going to work for the project I'm creating. So with my sentiments, I'm going to match up the die that coordinates with it. So there are some sentiment strips. There's a long strip die that goes with that. And then there's some other sentiments that are all on one plate together, and there's a single die that goes with that. I like to use some Best Ever Craft tape to tape that die in place when I'm doing my die cutting. I want to make sure that it stays in the same spot while I'm doing that die cutting. And then I will set those sentiments over to the side to be ready to grab as I'm creating. So while I'm prepping and creating before creating my cards, I'm also going to use that stamp set of the month. Anytime I have a new stamp set, I like to use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue, takes that or makes that stamp take ink just a little bit better. Then once I'm done with that eraser, I use a brush to brush off on any eraser bits, and I just do the entire stamp set at once, even if I'm only using one stamp. That way when I come back to that set next, if I've only used one stamp, I know I've done the whole set. It's just easy to do the entire thing all at once. It only needs to be done the first time. It doesn't need to be done every time you use that set. I'm stamping these images on hammermill cardstock as well. I typically use hammermill cardstock for a lot, for the foiling, for stamping, for ink blending. I have it always on hand, and I really like the feel of it and how well it works. So I'm going to heat emboss these sentiments with black embossing powder. I want all of my sentiments as well as my pressed images to be in black. You could use metallic or other colors of embossing powder if you wanted to add a pop of color if you want. I use embossing powder tool on that cardstock before stamping it with that Versamark ink. Then I pour my powder on top of there and pour the excess back in the jar and use my heat tool to melt it. Now, anytime I'm doing sentiments, I do like to use extra fine embossing powder as well as press plates. When I'm using press plates, I like to use extra fine embossing powder when possible. I just find it gives it a little bit more detail. If I don't have it available, I just use regular embossing powder. But for my basic colors, I have the super fine so that it gets that little bit of extra detail to it. Once I have those embossed, I let that cool for just a moment, and then I match up the different dies to go with those sentiments. The one on the bottom of the page, right now it's on the top left. I'm not using that one. When I did my embossing, there was one letter that I actually didn't notice I didn't heat emboss. So as I was moving it around, I kind of brushed the unembossed powder off. So I won't be using that, but we have a ton of sentiments here. I end up having a lot left over from this. But again, just like I said before, I like to have a lot of choice while I'm creating, and I don't always know exactly which sentiment I'm going to want to use while I'm creating. So I'd rather have more and save the excess than not do enough. And while we're doing this, if we're doing a bunch of sentiments all at once, it takes no extra time to do them all at once than it does to do one or two. So we might as well have those extra ones done. Now I'm going to use the Better Press system with that press and foil plate of the month. I center it in the center and then put a piece of A2 cardstock 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. Tape it to that clear plate. I'm going to do this in black embossing powder as well. Once I'm creating, I do find that I think it might have been better if I had, say, used some gold or silver embossing powder just for a little bit of extra color, a little bit of extra metallic tone to it, but you can do it in whatever ones you're wanting. It wasn't until I was in the middle of doing it that I was like, there's a lot of black outlines here that a different color might have been nice to add. Not that I don't like them. They're just, sometimes you want that little bit of metallic for that, just to take it to the next level. So I use my embossing powder tool on the cardstock, use that Versamark pad on my press plate, put the base to the clear plate to the base, and then ran it through my die cutting machine to press those, that image in there, and then use the embossing powder on that background before putting the excess back in the container and heat embossing it. I didn't find I needed to do it with this embossing session, but if you find you have any powder sticking where you don't want it to, just use a soft brush and remove it before embossing. If you do it or you try to wait till after embossing, once it's melted into that paper, it's not going to go anywhere. So if by chance, and you do notice it when you use black powder on white cardstock or white powder on black cardstock, you notice it a little bit more. So it's easy to see where there might be powder where you don't want it. Then using that heat embossing or that embossing tool to melt that powder. Now this border goes almost all the way to the edge. So with the cards that I'm using to create with that, I make smaller borders around them, but we're not using them quite yet. I'll set those over to the side. For my first card, I'm using the Market Crates 3D embossing folder. I'm using it with some fawn cardstock and using the 3D embossing folder stacking on my die cutting machine. Now I wanted this to look like a bunch of crates that had, I'm going to use the broccoli from the large die of the month, and I wanted it to look like the wood crate. So I'm using that fawn cardstock, and then I'm going to use some vintage photo distress ink to ink it up to bring out the pattern of those crates. I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches before I'm doing my inking as well as ink blending. I always like to start with a bit of bigger cardstock when I'm doing embossing and then trim it down afterwards. Sometimes with folders, especially 3D folders, I find that it just skews the measurements a little bit. So I find that having a little piece that's a little bit bigger to start with makes it easier because I can trim it down to the exact size once I'm done. Once I have that ink blending done, I just use an X-Acto knife and a mat and just cut on the top of one of those crates. When I was putting that cardstock in there, I planned it so that it looked like some crates stacking up. So I wanted it to look like crates stacked up with some broccoli sticking out. So I have the heads of the broccoli die cut out of Rainforest cardstock. I'm using some Mowed Lawn Distress ink just to ink the underside to give it a little bit of color variation. The stems are die cut from Fern cardstock, and I actually ended up messing up when I did my recording of this, and I didn't mess up, or I didn't record the assembly. They're really easy to assemble, those little broccoli pieces. And then I added a mat to the card that was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, put my embossed piece on top, but made sure not to put glue where that opening was so I could easily just tuck those pieces of broccoli right in there. For my next card, I'm using that Market Tote die again. This time I'm pairing it with the Market Weave embossing folder of the month. I thought it would look nice if my tote looked like it was kind of burlap. So I trimmed that piece of cardstock with the border die from the Market Totes die set, put it in the Market Weave embossing folder, and then ran it through my die cutting machine. And I put it in there so that the edge of that tote was on the edge of the folder, so that it kind of, the folder pattern kind of worked out to nothing on the edge. Then I'm using that Vintage Photo Distress ink to ink blend both my handle as well as my tote, and then the two little patches or little squares that go on the handle. Now I ink blended them first, wanted the pattern to show up just a little bit more. So once I'm done ink blending them, I ran my pad right over top of the texture of the tote. You could leave this part out if you don't want that texture to be quite so noticeable. You don't have to do that part, but I wanted it to be very visible on there. So for this particular card, I'm using the tulips from that Market Tote die set. There is a ton of different choice in there. There's the broccoli that I used in the last card. There is a loaf of bread. There's a jar of milk. I'm sure I'm missing some other things, but there's a bunch of different things to pick and choose from. I just thought it would be fun to do the tulips. I have them die cut out of some mulberry and orchid cardstock, layering those pieces together. Now I have the back with orchid and the front with mulberry, or the back with mulberry and the front with orchid. I wanted to make sure that you could see the different layers to it, so I just swapped them back and forth. Then my greenery is die cut out of Rainforest cardstock, and that is ink blended with that Mowed Lawn. The tulips are ink blended with Seedless Preserves to give them just a little bit of visual interest or a little bit of visual dimension. Then I'm going to glue the tulips to the stems, but I'm leaving the leaves separate for now. I want to make sure that when I'm assembling my card, I can put those leaves wherever I want them to. So by assembling or by adding them later, it makes it more, or it makes it easier for assembly for me. For the tote part, I'm only putting the glue on the two sides as well as the bottom so that I can easily tuck those tulips into the little tote, making it so that I don't run into areas where I've glued. Then I'm going to put the handles on there, but I'm only going to glue the bottoms of the handle so that I can easily add those tulips tucked in behind there. I want to, again, make sure that I don't have pieces glued down that I want to have the tulips behind. By doing it this way, I have a little bit more freedom and I can easily glue that handle to that bag down after I'm done. Then I'm going to simply add the different tulips, and I try to make sure that we have a dark one beside a light one so that we don't have clumps of the same color variation all together. I'm starting kind of at the back. I want to make sure that I do the taller ones first, and then I'll do the shorter ones in front. I don't want to have taller ones in front of shorter ones. So I am working so that we have tulips on or throughout that whole bag. I want to make sure that it looks like it's full. Now I did the tulips die several times. I think I did it 6 times with each of the colors. So we have a lot of tulips here. Now I did my tulips the same colors as well. Like I did them all purple. This would also be fun to do a variation of different colors if you wanted to have a bunch of different colors. I just really liked those purples and wanted to do just the purples with this particular variation of it. And again, these tulips could easily be used with other dies as well. I think these would be really pretty just on their own with, say, a vase, or like in, say, a vase or something. I think it would be a beautiful spring card. Once I have all of my tulips down, I can easily add those leaves. And again, I start tucking them towards the back first and then fill my way towards the front. I just kind of look where I think it would look natural to have the leaf from the tulip out, and then put it there basically. Now I'm using liquid glue. I have Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle, so it works for really tiny die cuts as well as assembling my cards. And because it's liquid glue, I have that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place, and I like that about liquid glue. You don't need to use a whole lot, but you do have that wiggle room with it. Once I have all of the tulips and leaves in there that I think I need, there's two that I missed and added afterwards, I glue that handle down, and I'm using a large acrylic block to hold things down nice and flat when I'm assembling. That way I have my hands free to do other things. And I can see through it, so I can see that if something moved on me while I put that block down. I took one of my sentiments, added it to the bottom of the tote, and we have a very simple but beautiful card. Next one, I'm going to use that stitching die of the month, the Rooting for You. I have a bunch of pieces die cut here. I'm going to create a carrot, an onion, as well as a beet. Now I have 3 different flosses to stitch them with. I chose colored flosses that were similar in color to the cardstock that I had die cut out of. So I have the carrot cut out of carrot cardstock because I just thought the name meant it should be that way. I'm using some CMC floss 741 to do the stitching for that. And when I do the stitching, I usually use 2 strands of floss. I like to tape that floss down at the start with some Best Ever Craft tape, just a tiny little piece just to hold it in place. And the stitching for the carrots is just kind of some random lines or dashes on the carrot, kind of looking like the lines that carrots have. For the onion and the beet, it's more of a starburst pattern. They both have the same starburst pattern. The cool thing about stitching dies when you die cut with them, especially Spellbinders ones, I haven't used stitching dies from other companies, is they leave a little dash or leave a little indent showing you where they intend for that stitching to go. So there's very little guesswork to it. I like to die cut an extra piece. I like to die cut a solid piece if possible, and I like to glue that to the back of my stitch piece. It just encloses that stitching. It makes it nice and neat. It also makes it a lot easier for assembly because I'm just assembling cardstock to cardstock. When you do the stitching, it adds extra dimension to the background. So once I add that stitching and then put that piece on, or that solid piece on the back, it adds extra dimension to that die cut. Once I have those glued together, I just use sewing clips to hold those die cuts together while I'm stitching the next piece. That way I'm not sitting there holding it together, and they hold nice and firmly. I'm going to do the beet next, and I'm using number 552 DMC floss for that stitching. For the onion, I'm doing that off screen because it's exactly the same stitching as the beet, and for that one I use number 728. So with the beet, I do the same thing. I start off and tape the floss in place and then just work my way around with that starburst pattern. It's really, really easy. Start in the middle, go to each of the holes around the outside edges. Once I'm done doing that full circle, then I'm going to tape that floss in place with some Best Ever Craft tape, glue it to my solid piece, and use those sewing clips to hold those in place. So I did the onion off screen, like I said, because it's exactly the same as the beet. Taping it in place once I'm done, and then gluing the solid piece to the back of it. So these dies here have a solid piece for the vegetables as well as a stitching die insert, which I find really handy, especially for giving it more use or multiple uses. I'm going to be using this for this card where I do the stitching. For the next card, I'm going to use the beets where I'm not stitching them. I'm just using them with the outline die cut and just creating some beets for the front of one of those press and foil images. For my greenery, that's all die cut out of some rainforest cardstock, and then I have some of that mulberry cardstock to add the pinky purpley detail to the beet leaves. I'm doing a little bit of ink blending on these pieces to give them some visual dimension. I have some truffle cardstock for the earth or the ground here, and I have some vintage photo distress ink to ink blend there. You're not going to see a lot of the ink blending because that truffle cardstock is really quite dark. ink blending with Mowed Lawn on the greenery. And I'm doing the beet leaves with that ink after I added that pinky purple color to it, so that I get a little bit of that on that detail of those die cuts as well. For the onions, there's some little root pieces as well as a piece that goes right at the bottom of the green parts of the onion. So I glue those on before adding them to my stitch piece. For the carrot tops here, there's a little ball at the bottom of those die cuts. I just layered them on top of each other before layering my carrot on top of that, putting that acrylic block on top of there to hold that in place while I'm assembling the beet. And I did the beet the exact same way that I did the carrot, just layered those leaves on top of each other before gluing the beet on top of it, and let that dry for a few moments before I start to assemble my card. Now in this die set, there's also a plant sign. I don't know what they're called. I have one die cut for this. It said rooting for you, but I end up choosing to use one of my previously done sentiments. So you could use that little tag if you want, and there's an alternative insert for that, so you can pick and choose which sentiment you put in there, or you can add a sentiment from either the stamp set or from the press plate. They all work really, really well together. So there's a lot of choice when it comes to adding those sentiments. So for assembling this card, I added the earth piece, then start assembling my little vegetables on top of it. And I love the little extra detail that the stitching gives to it. Just makes it more interesting and has a little bit more detail to it. So I added that sentiment and then realized I didn't need the plant sign. So I just tucked that to the side, and I'll use it in a future project. So this one here has a ton of texture and dimension to it between the stitching as well as the layers of those dies. So I'm going to use a couple of my press and foil images here. I have this one here is one of the foiled ones. It's really hard to tell on camera the foiled ones from the stamped and embossed ones. So I'm going to put beets on here. I want this to look a little bit like a seed packet, but I do have a sentiment that is from the stamp set that I'm going to add to the bottom of it. So I added those little purpley layers to the leaves. I'm going to ink blend this very similar to how I ink blended the last one. So I'm using the Mowed Lawn on the leaves. I'm going to use some seedless preserves on the beets. And then I'm also going to add just a little bit of that vintage photo to the bottom root of the beet, just to give it a little bit more of the look of a beet. So once I have that done, I'm ready to add that to the front of the card. Now the image for that Better Press and Foil plate is quite big. So I have that trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And my mat around it is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So we have a lot less of a mat than I usually do. So that way we're not cutting into the image from this press and foil plate. So I'm using some Tombow markers just to color in some of the detail. The green that I'm using is 133. The purple that I'm using is 676. I tried to choose colors that were similar to the die cuts that I were using. Now the lines around the outside, it looks like when you first look at it, it looks like they could be colored, but they're not actually closed areas. When you really look at them, it's kind of almost like a maze that is open. So I didn't end up coloring them because there wasn't an easy or a neat way to color it that would have kind of a complete frame to it. So I left those as they are. And that's why I say that it might be nice to use, say, gold or silver embossing here, because it would give it that extra little bit of detail. I still like the black, but I also think it would look nice in other colors. And I'm doing these or combining these with other clubs, but this is just a frame. It could easily be used as a frame with other stamps, other foil plates, other die cuts as well. So I'm going to add those beets to there and then add the sentiment to the bottom. Now I left the sentiment as is, but you could take that Seedless Preserves ink or that Mowed Lawn ink and color it if you wanted to add a little bit of extra color to that sentiment to make that pop just a little bit more. But I wanted my beets to be the focus there, so I left it with them. For the next one, this one is the heat embossed Better Pressed image. So I'm using the stamp of the month, the Fresh Packed. There is a nice flower in here, so I'm going to use that to stamp on the center of this particular piece. I'm using the Mowed Lawn for my stems and leaves, and then I'm going to be using the Seedless Preserves for the flowers. There's also some lemons, there's strawberries, I think a tomato, so there's a few different ones that you can pick and choose from here, but I thought it would look nice to have that heat embossed outer frame with the stamped image on the center. I'm using my Misty stamping tool to place those so that I can stamp it multiple times in exactly the same spot, and I know that I'm going to get a nice complete image. This image is super simple as well. All of the stamps from the stamp of the month are just two pieces. There's greens, and then there's the either flowers in this case or berries or vegetables. Once I have that stamped in place, this is when I'm going to trim that down, and it gets trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I also cut a blank piece that is 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I'm just going to use that mowed lawn pad to ink around there, so that's going to match perfectly with my greens that I stamped. For this particular image, I chose to grab my sticky mat, use the Seedless Preserves Distress ink to ink blend around it just to give it a little bit of color. To me, it had just a little bit too much white space for the look that I was going for, and I thought it would look nice to have that purple ink blended around it just to fill it in a little bit more. Another option here would be to do that flower on a separate piece and have some die cut layers in the center of that packet. I opted to go with this version instead. So once we have that ink blended, we're ready to start assembling our card. And I really like how that ink blending fills in that area. And that's where if I had some gold or metallic embossing for that instead of black, it probably would have contrasted with the purple ink blending just a little bit more than the black does. The black ends up being a little bit more subtle with that ink blending around it. So I'm going to glue my mat as well as my upper layer to my A2 card base. And then to add just a touch of texture to it, I added some stickles to the center of the flowers. It's not going to change the color at all. It's just an iridescent. So we're going to see the color underneath here. It's just going to add that little bit of extra texture as well as sparkle. For my next card, using that press and foil plate for the background, I'm using the die of the month, the Pansy seed. I have them die cut out of the orchid and the mulberry cardstock, ink blending that with Seedless Preserves, and then my greenery is die cut out of rainforest cardstock and ink blended with some mowed lawn. I wanted to add a little bit of extra shimmer to this, so I grabbed my interference inks. I'm using crushed velvet interference ink on those violets. Then it's just going to add that extra little bit of shimmer to it. For the centers of the pansies, I have them die cut out of beeswax cardstock, and I end up inking them with the Lisa Horton gold pad just to give them a little bit of extra shimmer on the inside of the card. For the plate or the bowl, the pot, I have that die cut out of some cinnamon cardstock and just doing some ink blending with that vintage photo just to give it a little bit more of a used dirty pot kind of look to it. The centers of those flowers, like I said, I'm doing the gold. I'm just using a detail brush with it because those pieces are so small. And then we're ready to start assembling. Now I could take all of these pieces off and assemble them off my mat. Sometimes it's easier just to leave them on the mat and assemble them as I'm taking them off. So I'm going to start with my pot. There is that top rim, and then there's the upper rim, the lip of the pot. Then there's the piece that looks like the dirt in there or inside the pot. What I'm going to do with that is I'm only going to add glue to the upper layer of the pot. That way when I go to add my pansies, I'll have that opening that I can put the leaves and the stems in. Then I'm ready to start the pansies here. There's 2 pansies in different sizes as well as a bud. Now I add the upper layer to that trio of petals. Then I add the inner piece with that beeswax cardstock. Now there's 2 extra petals that get tucked behind there. I almost forget to put them on, and I end up almost putting it onto the stem before putting those petals on there, but I catch myself last moment. So those petals are die cut out of that orchid cardstock, so the darker color. You could do it out of the dark or the lighter color, or a combination of the darker and the lighter, so it's really up to you which ones. I always love purple pansy, so this is why I chose this color, the purpley pinky ones. But again, they come in a few different color tones, so you can pick and choose which one you want. You can even do a plant with a combination of different colors if you want. I think it's the front cover of that or the die of the month that shows it in a few different colors, so you can have a lot of fun with that. So the petals just tuck in right behind the trio of petals for the front. Then that gets glued to the little dot for the stem of it. And then again, just like the other tulips, I leave my leaves off so that I can just tuck them in to the plant when I am assembling my card. For this, I have a mat that is cut out of that orchid cardstock. You can see this is where I cut my petals out of. This is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. Then I'm going to use the solid hot foil piece for my image piece. I thought it would add a lot of contrast and just something a little bit different from the last two cards. I actually really like the look of this solid hot foil piece with that black background with those pansies on top of it. Now, the one thing to note though, because this is solid hot foiled, it's a non-porous surface. So it is going to take just a little bit longer for those pansies to dry on there. So we don't have the glue absorbing from both the top layer and the bottom layer. It's going to take just a little bit of extra patience for that. And because of that, you'll notice as I'm assembling that sometimes some pieces slide a little bit. So you do have to be careful of that, because otherwise that glue is going to leave just a little smear or a mark on that foiling. So you just have to be a little bit more careful with that, a little bit more patient with a solid hot foiled background. Once we have those two pansies in there, I'm adding that little bud. Now the stems for the bud, you can choose whether you want it to be facing the left or facing the right. And I love when die cuts do that. So you can pick and choose how you want that bud to be facing. You don't have to put a die cut backwards in order to do that. It's possible, but I always don't, I never like to have a die cut backwards because I don't like the cut edge on the bottom side. So once I have those 3 flowers in place, now I'm ready to start filling in that plant with those leaves. And this is where using liquid glue really comes in handy, because you'll notice as I'm doing this, sometimes I'll decide to tuck a leaf behind another one. Because it takes just a little bit of extra time for that glue to dry, it makes it really easy to be able to do this. I can easily slide things in, and I have that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. And I also can easily tuck a leaf behind another one that I've put down, because I know that glue isn't going to have set already. So I'm focusing more of my leaves towards the bottom of the plant, but I do have a few behind the flower as well. And if you wanted to change this up just a little bit, you could use this pot from the die of the month and use the tulips from the large die of the month and have the tulips growing out of the pot. I think that would look cute as well and give you another variation, another different way to use those two together. So the last step, once the pansy is assembled, is to add my sentiment to the bottom. Then I wanted to add just a touch of sparkle. So I'm using the stickles on just the upper layer of the center of the pansy. There's 2 different layers to it. So just the upper layer, just to add a little bit of sparkle. We already have that shimmer from the interference ink, but I thought a little bit of extra sparkle on top of that would be nice. For the next card, I'm using the Market Berries stencil of the month. This has 5 different layers to it. I'm going to do a combination of distress inks as well as interference inks to add that extra little bit of shimmer. Sometimes with stenciled images, they can look a little bit flat, so I always love finding different ways to give them a little bit more interest, a little bit more texture. So for this first layer, I'm using Mowed Lawn, and I'm making the ink darker towards the cluster, the center of the cluster of leaves, lighter towards the outside. So that gives it a little bit more interest. Then I'm taking some interference ink in Magic Garden and adding a little bit of that interference ink in the center of those leaves as well. That's going to deepen that color, but it's also going to add that little bit of shimmer. Now, interference inks, if you've never used them before or heard of them before, they're kind of like a magic ink pad. They have 2 colors to them, one that shows up on light or white cardstock. In this case, it is green. One that shows up on black or dark cardstock, that would be the interference color, and in this case it's purple. So you don't see purple on this until you start to tilt it into the light, then you see that little bit of purple shimmer. But if I were to use this color or that pad on black cardstock, you wouldn't see the green, you would only see the purple, which is why I always call them magic pads, because they just have a magic quality to them. For the next layer of the stencil, this one is mostly stems as well as the tops of the strawberries. So I'm doing a fairly even coat of that Mowed Lawn, making it a little bit darker than the last layer so that it looks like it is just a darker shade of that same color. Next, we have these strawberries. So for layering these together, it's really quite easy. There's little marks on all 4 corners to show an A2 card size. So 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. So I line those up as well as making sure it lines up with my pattern. So for inking my berries, I'm using Cherry Bomb Interference. So this is a nice pinky red, but the interference color to it is purple. So when we tilt this into the light, we're going to see a little bit of a purple shimmer on it. I'm trying to make it so that the tops of the berries are darker and it's lighter towards the bottom. With interference inks, it's harder to fade it out to nothing. So they're really quite juicy pads. So it's a little bit harder to blend them in together because they do dry quite quickly, which is why you see me inking my brush quite often. And by using different pressures, I can get at different amounts of ink on there. So this layer is done. I can take this stencil off. You can see that with each layer, I also tape my stencil to the mat. That's just because there's not really a whole lot of stencil touching the mat. So it would be easy to, with the pressure of inking it, for it to move around, and I don't want it to do that. The next layer is the flowers from the strawberries. Ink blending those with scattered straw distress ink. I'm going to add a little bit of gold to the center of those flowers using that Lisa Horton gold pad as well as the detailed blending brush. I don't want to have the entire flower to be gold, but I do want to add just a little bit of metallic touch, a little bit of metallic detail to the center of them just to give it some color variation. So I'm starting at the center of each one of those flowers and just kind of using a circular motion, blending my way out. Now, you can use as much or as little of this ink as what you want. You could even use the gold pad to completely cover those flowers gold, but I like the combination of that scattered straw with that gold in the center. For my last layers, the last stencil layer adds the center to these flowers as well as the little seeds to the outside of the strawberries. Now, I wanted them to be black, but I also wanted to use texture paste with them. I don't have a glossy black texture paste. I wanted the finish to be glossy. I have a matte black texture paste, but I didn't want the finish for these to be matte. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use black soot distress ink, put a nice even coat all the way through all of the different holes. And I'm using a large stencil brush and the holes are quite small. So you'll see that I'm going in clockwise and counterclockwise motion to make sure to fill in all of those different areas. And then I'm going to use some transparent gloss texture paste to fill that in to give it the look of glossy black texture paste. So we're going to be able to see that black ink underneath there because it's transparent texture paste, and because this texture paste has a glossy finish, it's just going to look like glossy black. And I want to make sure that I cover the whole thing because as I'm doing this, I'm going to get that black soot distress ink mixed in with that texture paste on my palette knife. So I don't want to put my palette knife back in my container. So I'm using more than I really need just to make sure that I don't run out in the middle of this. Now you want to clean off that palette knife as well as the stencil so that that doesn't dry on there. So I do that while this is drying. I let it dry for about an hour, and here is the finished result. So we have lots of color variation between the light and dark shades of ink, as well as the shimmer from the different interference inks that were used. And then we have the texture from the black seeds as well as the black centers to those flowers. So for this card, I trimmed down my stencil image to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So I am trimming some of that edge or some of the edge of that stenciled image off. It just kind of looks like a background print. And then I trimmed some cranberry cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for a mat around it. Now I just add a simple sentiment to it. I want the focal point to be my stenciled background. I just think it's really pretty and I didn't want to cover it up. So all I did was add a sentiment to it. You could also take the strawberry die cuts from the All Crate Club's exclusive die set, the Market Jar Trio, and you could add strawberry die cuts to this as well if you wanted. To be honest, I didn't do it because that background is so busy that I didn't think the strawberries would really be highlighted there or stick out very well, so I just wanted to keep it very simple. So for this one, I used one of my solid hot foiled sentiments to finish off that card. Now I'm going to create 3 cards with that Market Jar Trio All Club Crate exclusive die set as well as the coordinating stamp set. Before I do anything with the die set, I'm going to create my sentiments with the stamp set. So just like before, I used a white eraser on that stamping surface so that I get a nice, crisp, clean image. I have a scrap piece of cardstock here. I'm going to stamp 3 different sentiments, and I want to make sure that I leave room to be able to die cut them. This matches one of the dies in that die set, so I want to make sure that I have the space between each one of those stamped sentiments to make sure that I can die cut them without infringing on the other one. So I use that die set to be able to place those stamps where I want them to go, making sure that I have enough space between the 3 of them. So there are different coordinating die cut pieces that you can put inside these jars, and the sentiments coordinate with them. So I'm going to do one with a jar of olives, one with a jar of pickles, and then I'm going to do a shaker card with the strawberry strawberries. So it looks like some strawberry jam. So I'm stamping these. I'm heat embossing them with that black embossing ink, same as the other embossing that I've done in this video. Used a little bit of that embossing powder tool on the cardstock to make sure that my embossing powder was only going to stick to those sentiments. And then I put the extra back into the jar and heat emboss them. So here, as I'm embossing, you can see those sentiments in there. They've got little puns to them, so they're perfect to go with the different die cuts for those jars, as well as they just match perfectly to the label for those jars. So I really like how these two exclusive items or bonus items really coordinate well with each other. So before I go and die cut these sentiments out, there is a couple strawberry stamps in the fresh packed stamp set of the month. So I'm just going to stamp them on the label for the strawberry jam. I'm using the Cherry Bomb interference ink to stamp the berries themselves, and then I'm going to be using the Modelon Distress ink for the tops of the strawberries. Now, when I had envisioned this in my head, I thought there was going to be room on that label to stamp the berries so they weren't covered in any of the words, or you could see them without the words, but you really can't. You really have to just cover or put it on the words. But because we have those words heat embossed with black embossing powder, they resist that ink anyway, so it's not going, it just looks like it's behind the printed label, and we can still read the words nice and clearly. So with that done, we're ready to die cut those pieces. So I am going to use the Best Ever Craft Tape to hold my die in place while I am die cutting them. Again, I want to make sure that the label, the words are centered on that die, and I want to make sure that it's not going to move on me. So I tape that in place, run it through my machine, and die cut each one of those so they're ready for when I assemble my jars. So I'm starting off with my jar of olives first. Now for the jar itself, I wanted them to be nice and shiny. So I used some clear Duralar to die cut those pieces out. It die cuts nicely, so I don't have to worry about it warping that Duralar, but it gives that jar a nice shiny finish. So I assembled 2 of the olives on screen. The rest of them I assembled off screen. Those are die cut out of rainforest cardstock as well as some cranberry cardstock. My jar itself is die cut out of fog cardstock. I wanted it to look like a jar, but I didn't want the outline to be to take attention away from the label and the olives. The jar lid is die cut from some Silver Treasured cardstock in the matte finish. I wanted it to look like a canning jar lid. And then I have a piece for the top there, die cut out of cranberry cardstock. Now, because we're using metallic cardstock that has a non-porous finish, as well as that Duralar, we're going to need to give that a little bit of extra time to dry because those 2 surfaces are non-porous and they're also fairly slippery. So we need to make sure that our die cuts don't accidentally shift and move and slip on us. And when you look at the back of the Duralar, you can see that the glue goes from white to clear, so you can tell when it's completely dried. I have a solid piece for my jar that I can start gluing my olives on while the front of the jar is drying. I start at the bottom of the jar and work my way up, but I can also tuck pieces in behind. Same as with the flowers. I want to make sure that I have the ability to be tucking things in behind, and by using a liquid glue I can easily do that. I work fairly quickly when I'm doing this. I'm also making sure that the olives are pointing in different ways. We don't want them all pointing in exactly the same way because it wouldn't look very natural that way. Now I just did a bunch of them on the side. I didn't really count how many olives I made. I wanted to make sure that it was going to fill in, half of the jar. I didn't want it just to be a couple at the bottom of the jar. So it ends up filling it up to just behind the label. You could easily add more if you wanted it to be filled up. You could also leave some space behind there because we have that label covering up a certain area. We don't necessarily need olives behind that. We could easily just leave that space blank and then put some olives on top of that. I wasn't really thinking of that while I was assembling. For the mat for this piece, I have a piece of cranberry cardstock cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and then a piece of white hammer mill cardstock in front of that is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I glued my jar on top of there and added one of the extra stamped and embossed sentiments. This is the clear Duralar that I used for the die cuts for my jars. Again, I liked it to look like it was a jar, so I wanted that glossy finish to it. You don't necessarily need that, but I think it definitely finishes it off and makes it look more authentic. So there is the olive one. Now we're going to do the pickle one. So for my pickle one, the outline of the jar was also cut out of fog cardstock, just like my last one. The solid piece to the jar was cut out of peridot cardstock. I wanted it to look like it had some pickle juice in it. And then my pickles themselves are die cut out of some rainforest as well as fern cardstock. Gluing the two pieces together, they layer together really quite easily. So once I have them layered together, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending on this one just to give it some visual dimension to it. This is a step that you could easily miss if you want, but I do think that ink blending adds that extra detail and makes it, or just takes it to the next level. I think it makes it look a little bit more interesting. So for both the ink blending on my pickle jar as well as my pickles and my label, I'm using that Modelon. I like to do it on the label just to frame it a little bit. So I'll just use it with my brush, not putting any extra ink on there, just running that brush around the outside of the label. I think it just frames it in, but it just enhances it just a little bit. Then I'm using it on the pickles as well as the pickle jar, the pickle juice, just kind of doing an ombre effect with that. I don't want it covered with ink. I want to have some areas that are light, some areas that are dark, and keep it interesting. So I'm going to glue the frame to that acetate piece, to that Duralar piece. Then I'm going to glue the jar piece. And just like the last one, this is die cut out of that matte silver treasured cardstock. Then for this one, I didn't realize I didn't die cut a piece for the top of the jar. So I'm just using my fern mat that I have trimmed down ready for my card. And I'm going to die cut out of the center of that. We have a piece of hammermill cardstock going on top of that, plus we have our pickle jar die cut on top of that. No one is ever going to know anything was die cut out of there, and rather than using an extra piece of cardstock cutting into an extra piece of cardstock, it just extends your cardstock a little bit more. I'm going to glue that onto the front there, set that to the side so it can start drying, and then add the pickles to the inside of the jar. So I only have 3 pickles here, but you could easily cut more if you wanted to fill it up a little bit more, but I think this is enough to get the idea of the pickle jar. When I'm gluing that Duralar piece down, I'm just putting that glue behind the cardstock so that we don't see adhesive on the front of there. I want to make sure that that adhesive is not visible. The funny thing about this one, with doing that peridot cardstock in the background, it almost looks like the Duralar is like a lime green color. So it actually totally changes the look of this one. Then I added the label to the front, set that aside to dry just a bit so we can start assembling our card. So we put that mat on there first, plus that little piece of hammermill cardstock. Now the hammermill on there, I didn't ink blend any of them because I want that pickle jar, the olive jar, and then in the next one, the jam jar to be the focal point. I want them to have all of the color. So I didn't think it needed any color or any texture to the background, but if you wanted, you could easily use the embossing folders to add texture to the background, or you could do some ink blending on there to add some color. But I just love the look. This pickle jar covers most of that card, so it just really fills in the whole thing, and the Duralar just makes it look more authentic, as I've said before, and takes it to the next level. Then I added one of my solid hot foiled sentiment strips to the bottom just to finish that off, and it tied in toward or with the sentiment that was on the label as well. For this next one, we're going to create a jam jar, and this is going to actually be a shaker card. I thought it worked perfectly for that, and I have some sequins ready to go to put in there. So these are the strawberry die cuts that I was talking about that you could add to that strawberry background, the stenciled background. I didn't because I didn't think it was really going to enhance that card enough. Didn't think it was going to be showing those strawberry die cuts enough, and I wanted the focal point to be that stenciled background, but they're absolutely adorable little strawberries. I die cut the background piece or the solid piece with Raven cardstock, the strawberries themselves with cranberry cardstock, and put a little bit of that Cherry Bomb interference ink, just ink blended towards the top just to give it that interference shimmer, just to give it a little bit of extra texture, and then a little bit of Magic Garden interference ink on the top of the greenery for the sprigs or the greens for the strawberry. So my jar for this is done in the same way as the last two, except the solid one, rather than having a separate solid piece behind it, I'm using the inner piece, and I'm going to die cut that from the front of my card, the hammermill cardstock. So I take that inner piece there and I tape it to my card, and I'm making sure that that tape is on the inside of the die so that when I die cut it, that tape will press into the cardstock, and sometimes you'll get a mark from the tape. I don't want to have that on the front of my card. So by taping that on the inside of the die, I know that piece is going to be coming out, so it's not going to be on the front of my card. So this piece here is what's going to create the shaker. So rather than die cut my piece of Duralar, I have a piece that I'm just going to tape to the back of my die cut piece here. So I'm just using some double-sided tape for this. You could use the Barely Art glue here, but you would need to wait for it to dry a little bit, and I didn't want to wait. Use some 1/4 inch score tape just because it was going to be quicker. So I put that right around the outside of my die cut jar piece, then added that Duralar to the opening. Now I can add my jar die cut to the front of the card. This is easy to use that Barely Art glue for it and glue that around there. So it's going to give a very similar look to the last two cards. However, we're going to have some shaker bits behind it. So it's going to have a little bit of extra movement, and it's really easy, as you can see, to just change this up just a little bit. You just die cut your pieces just a little bit differently. Then I'm going to add the label to the front of the jar so that that can be sitting to the side and drying. I have one of my solid hot foiled strips that I'm going to add there as well. That just coordinates with the sentiment on the front of the jar. For the background of my card, I have an A2 card base mat that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And I'm going to glue that to the front of the card. That cranberry cardstock we're going to be seeing through the opening of the jar. So it's going to look like the inside pieces of the jar are that cranberry color with the shaker bits inside. Then I'm going to use some foam tape right around the opening there. So I have some double thick foam tape here. I'll have it linked in the description below, as well as all the other supplies that I'm using. You want to have this completely around the opening for your shaker. You don't want any opening pieces because we don't want our shaker bits to fall out of the card. I'm making sure that my foam bits are narrow enough to fit on those two sides without being shown on the inside of my shaker or the outside of my mat. If I need to, I can always trim them just a little bit thinner, a little bit narrower. I can also cut them a little bit shorter if I need to. So I want to make sure that my whole background here is completely supported, as well as making sure that I have a nice solid piece around the outside of my shaker so that those bits don't fall out of there. Then I can take the backing off. Now I have some sequins that I'm going to use for my shaker. These are actually extra sequins from one of the crafty advent calendars. Some of the days you get sequins in there. So I have a bunch of extra ones left over. I'm storing them in this 24-piece compartment here from Spellbinders. This is a new thing from them. These have ridges on the top of the lid, so I can put little bits in here and they're not going to fall into the compartment beside it because those ridges make them completely sealed. So this is perfect if you have a bunch of little bits and you don't want them, you want to store them to be able to see them and use them, but you don't want them falling into other areas. This is a great way to do it. I love the fact that I know that if I happen to store this or move this vertically, it's not going to, the pieces aren't going to spill into each of the other areas. So I put a bunch of those sequins down there and then made sure that they were concentrated in the middle of the card. So when I added the piece to the top of the card, I wasn't going to be putting them on any of those sequin pieces. I also made sure that I was laying or right above it so I could make it nice and centered on there. Then I'm going to add the strawberry die cuts to the bottom right side of the card, just to add a little bit of extra detail to it. You don't necessarily need those strawberries on there, but I do think they add some extra interest to the front of the card, extra little bit of texture. So here is our finished shaker card. It has a lot of movement to it. And I specifically chose the cranberry cardstock for the backs because I thought the sequins were going to show off really nicely on there. And I wanted to make sure that you were able to see that movement, able to see that different color on them, and that they have lots of movement on the inside of the card. They're super simple to make, but it's always fun to create something a little bit different, to create an interactive card that has that movement. Then we have our pickle jar with the punny sentiment on the front. I love when sets have different punny sentiments to go with them. I'm not really creative when it comes to naming things and sentiments, so I always love the extra help from different sentiment stamp sets as well as press plate sets. Then we have our olive jar, then our stenciled strawberry background. And again, you could easily add extra to this. You could put layers on the front and then do those strawberries if you wanted, but I think it's just such a pretty background. Then we have our violets, our pansy in the pot right on top of that solid hot foiled press plate background. I love the look of the dimension of those dies on that solid hot foil background, on that dark background. And then a very, very simple one with just the stamped flowers there. Again, super simple, but there's other ones in that stamp set that you could change it up if you wanted, or you could just do other die cuts like this one here with those beets. Love the combination of that pressed background with the dimension you get from the beet die cuts. Easy to swap out other vegetables from the stitching die of the month or from the Market Tote large die of the month. Then we have our stitch card with that extra little bit of stitched detail on there. And then our Market Tote with that tulips on the inside. Love those tulips in there. But again, there's a lot of different choices in that die set. You can easily swap them out and create lots of different variety with them. And then our very first card with the stacked crates with the broccoli coming out of them. Love the variety in this and the clubs for this month, as well as they're so perfect for so many different themes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.